Good evening. The headlines tonight, the 5th of June. The city of Rome is celebrating its liberation. Allied forces are in full control of the Italian capital following its fall yesterday. British and American bombers are tonight mounting heavy raids on the French coast near Calais. German radio is saying that an invasion is on the way. Princess Elizabeth has made her first public speech.
I should like to assure you that my own interest and my own service will always be given most wholeheartedly.
And Gone with the Wind, the film has closed in London after a record-breaking 4 years and 2 months. Exactly 4 years after Dunkirk, when troops were driven off the continent of Europe, the first major European capital is tonight under Allied control. Rome has been liberated and her people are celebrating. The Fifth Army reached Rome yesterday from the Anzio beachhead. According to reports, Allied forces encountered stiff resistance from the German defenders. But by midnight, that resistance had ended. Rome was in Allied hands. Tonight, the King of Italy, Victor Emmanuel, has handed over his royal powers to his son, Crown Prince Umberto. Mussolini, said to be somewhere in the north of the country, has ordered 3 days' mourning for the fall of the Italian capital.
The battle for Rome was brutal, and it is a famous victory. Before abandoning the Eternal City, as this captured German film shows, Hitler's legions did their utmost to hold the advancing Allies, fighting them grimly to the very outskirts of the capital. But only to the outskirts. Rome itself they have left intact, as promised yesterday by Hitler's headquarters. With its ancient monuments unscarred, a jewel of a city whose war-weary inhabitants erupted with joy as the Americans swept in. The reception was everywhere delirious. General Clark, the Fifth Army commander, drove in for a personal look. In one suburb, his troops encountered a wedding party. They'd set the day, and that was that. Crowds swarmed to the Vatican, to St. Peter's Square, for a blessing by Pope Pius, who thanked both Germans and Allies for sparing the city. Popular response was heartfelt. General Clark reported more than 20,000 Germans taken prisoner. Berlin radio, glossing over the defeat, said Rome does not matter. But it had done until German troops began their withdrawal a few days ago, a pullout covertly filmed by an anti-fascist Italian. They were abandoning not just one of the Axis capitals, but a strategically vital road and rail junction, abandoning too what General Clark termed untold quantities of battle equipment. So, while Romans rejoiced, most of them, at the liberation of their city, Allied military sources were reporting roads to the north clogged with retreating German columns. Rome celebrates, but Field Marshal Kesselring will be regrouping his battered divisions well north of the city. And as President Roosevelt reminded us trenchantly tonight, ahead lies yet greater effort and fiercer fighting on the long road to Berlin.
Once again, through the day and tonight, large numbers of British and American aircraft have been attacking German installations along the northern coast of France. The attacks are understood to be concentrated around Calais and Boulogne in the Pas de Calais.
In round-the-clock, wave-on-wave airstrikes, Allied bombers have kept up their fantastic pounding of the French Channel coast. Overnight, 260 RAF Halifaxes and Lancasters bombed German gun batteries, 3 in the Calais area and 1 in Normandy, the targets marked by low-flying RAF Mosquitoes. Today, up to 750 US flying Fortresses and Liberators, escorted by Mustang and Thunderbolt fighters, followed up the British assault and piled into the Pas de Calais area and targets further west. After many days without loss, a handful of US planes were today down by heavy anti-aircraft fire visible from the Kent coast. But again, it was a no-show by the Luftwaffe's fighters. Today's air missions, as during the past 50 days, targeted what the Germans call their Atlantic Wall. This interlinked system of beach defences and deadly crossfire positions so vaunted by Hitler stretches from the Pyrenees to Norway. It's believed to be strongest, however, between Le Havre and the Low Countries. With the white cliffs of Dover visible across the Channel, Field Marshal Rommel is shown here with Hermann Göring inspecting the wall's defences. Rommel reportedly has been ordered in by the Führer to go all out in the Pas-de-Calais defences to stop dead any attempt by the Allies to invade there. Most of the Atlantic Wall fortifications have been constructed by forced labour from occupied countries, including many Russian prisoners of war. Tonight's Allied raids on German defences in the Pas-de-Calais have strengthened speculation about the location of the expected landings on the continent.
German radio is reporting tonight that an invasion, as they're calling it, is coming, and that the Allied air offensive has switched from Germany to the Channel coast. In the United States, millions of radio listeners were told that the Allied armies had begun to invade the north coast of France. Church bells tolled, church services, films and sporting events were interrupted with the news, and the American telephone service briefly went haywire. But it was a false alarm, the result of a mistake in the London newsroom of the Associated Press. Joan Ellis, a British telegraphist in London, had fed the wrong piece of tape into a teletype transmitter, which flashed news of an invasion to the States. The information was cancelled 5 minutes later, but not before it had had a dramatic effect. Home again, more than 600 servicemen, many of them prisoners of war in Germany during the last 4 years, have docked at Liverpool. They've been repatriated because of illness or injury, and men of the Royal Army Medical Corps went out to bring them safely home.
The Gripsholm announces the arrival at Liverpool of 638 men who left these shores 4 years ago and have survived both battle and the horrors of German prisoner of war camps. There was a warm homecoming for British soldiers who in the early days of war had tried to save Norway or had fought in Greece or through the siege of Tobruk. There were the sick and the maimed amongst them, but many counted themselves lucky to be alive.
Where were you captured? I was captured in Greece. In Greece, eh? And you've been a prisoner quite a long time then? Oh, look, too long. But we want to tell you...
These men, listening to the speeches of welcome, had been exchanged for 4 trainloads of German prisoners. The swap took place at Barcelona. The returnees described conditions behind barbed wire in Germany as grim, especially in Warburg, known as a Nazi hell camp. But things had gradually improved as the Germans realized they were losing the war.
And what do you think of the Jerry? Do you think he sort of... Does he realize he's losing, or does he still think he's winning?
Well, the ones we were getting back from the Russian front were only too pleased to be back.
Yeah,
and they all seem to think that about this spring, it's all over.
The family of the aptly named Corporal Luck were overjoyed. They'd had almost no news of him for 4 years. The repatriation of this small band is a hopeful sign that soon perhaps others like Corporal Luck will be returning home.
Princess Elizabeth has made her first public speech. She was in Hackney in East London, where she was made the president of a hospital named after her mother, the Queen Elizabeth Hospital for Children. The formality of her election over, the princess, now 18 years old, rose to address the crowded room.
Lord Alice, ladies and gentlemen, I should like first to thank you all very much for the kind welcome you have given me today as your new president. And especially Lord Alice and Hillchild for what they have said in proposing my election. As the first act of my presidency, I should like to assure you that my own interest and my own service will always be given most wholeheartedly to what we all know to be a great cause.
The princess then toured the wards and chatted to nurses and children. Other home news now. The Minister for Information, Mr Brendan Bracken, has urged the BBC not to be afraid of politicians and to be more controversial. Speaking at a lunch in London, Mr Bracken said the BBC should not be intimidated by what he called political publicity hounds. At the same luncheon, to mark the 50th anniversary of the Promenade concerts, their creator, Sir Henry Wood, invited the BBC to become the curator of the concerts. Sir Henry, who was celebrating his 75th birthday, said he hoped with all his heart that the BBC would continue the Proms as a permanent annual institution for all time. The Labour MP, Mr Aneurin Bevan, has said he is prepared to resign his Ebervale seat and recontest it over the bill which makes strikes illegal. At a rally near Bolton, Mr Bevan said, once the worker has given up his right to strike, he has given up practically all he has got. The right to strike is what we are fighting for, he said. And speaking in Trafalgar Square, the actress Dame Sybil Thorndike has called for equal pay for women. Dame Sybil said the concept that a woman should be paid less than a man for doing the same job is almost prehistoric. The quads born 2 days ago in Lewisham, southeast London, are all making good progress. Their father, leading aircraftman Thomas Nee Robinson, has been granted a special 24 hours leave by the RAF to visit them. Mrs Nee Robinson will receive an extra £2 10 shillings a week from the RAF to look after the children. They're the 5th set of quads to be born in Britain in the past 12 months. The film Gone with the Wind, which it had been predicted would run all through the war, is ending its London run after 4 years and 2 months. GWTW, as it's become known, has become the film epic of the war years.
So many people wanted to see Hollywood's greatest spectacle that when it opened in London, performances began at breakfast time. Even during the worst raids of the Blitz, the fans stood firm. No one was going to give up his place in the queue. The film opened in America just as the war opened over here. Vivien Leigh joined her fellow stars Clark Gable and Olivier de Havilland at the premiere in Atlanta, where this epic of the American Civil War reached its fiery climax. During its London run, one fan was so enthralled by the burning of Atlanta that when she emerged from the Empire in Leicester Square and saw a red sky over the London docks, she thought for a moment she was still in the Old South, not in the middle of an air raid. Clark Gable has changed roles and costume. He's in the Army Air Force now, training to be an air gunner. Vivien Leigh is the Prime Minister's favourite film actress. Gone with the wind up is what we used to say about those who left the country when the war began. Not Miss Leigh. She and her husband, Mr. Laurence Olivier, are part of the war effort.
A senior American soldier has been demoted and sent home for careless talk at a cocktail party in London. Major General Henry Miller, Commanding General of the 9th Air Force Service Command and a former classmate of General Eisenhower, is said to have talked loosely about the approximate date of an Allied invasion of Europe. The Ministry of Information has renewed its warnings about the dangers of careless talk with this film.
Lovesick John Jones met indiscreet Mary Brown in a cafe. He said to her,
"Let's go to Coombe for a picnic on Saturday, Mary."
She said to him,
We can't do that, silly. It's closed to the public. There's a dump of our new mine detectors there.
the consequence was,
They're right overhead now, Centre.
Looks like the wood's gonna get it.
and the world said,
That's your fault, Mary. It's more important than ever nowadays not to indulge in careless talk.
And finally, the weather forecast for tonight. The strong southwesterly wind, which has been sweeping the Straits of Dover all day, moderated tonight. The wind has dropped. The English Channel is calmer and the cloud base is higher. The glass is steady. And that's the news tonight, the 5th of June, 1944. From the BBC, good night. Good evening. The headlines tonight, the 6th of June, 1944. The liberation of Europe has begun. At dawn today, the greatest invasion force ever assembled started landing on the north coast of France. By sea and by air, huge numbers of British, American and Canadian troops were put ashore in Normandy. Tonight, Allied forces are several miles inland and there is fighting on the outskirts of Caen. Mr. Churchill told the Commons this evening that all is going well. He said the operation had been carried out with much less loss than we expected. And in a broadcast tonight from Buckingham Palace, the King has called the nation to prayer.
The Lord will give strength unto his people, and the Lord will give his people the blessing of peace.
D-Day has come. The greatest military operation in history was launched this morning. 4 years after the retreat from Dunkirk, our forces have returned to the beaches of France to rid Europe of tyranny. British, American and Canadian troops, backed by 4,000 aircraft, have landed along the coast of Normandy. The assault had apparently been delayed 24 hours because of bad weather. First news that the landings had begun was given by the BBC at 9:32 this morning.
This is London. London calling in the home, overseas and European services of the BBC and through United Nations Radio Mediterranean. And this is John Snagg speaking. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, have just issued Communique number 1. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
It's now known that the timing of the invasion was agreed more than 6 months ago. The operation began last night with bombing raids. They were accompanied by airborne landings. A few hours later, thousands of troops were put ashore on the beaches of Normandy. Tonight, Allied forces have reached the outskirts of Caen, but little is so far known about the progress of the American landing forces. The Prime Minister, Mr. Churchill, has made 2 statements to the House of Commons. At midday, he said there were hopes that tactical surprise had been attained. At 9 o'clock tonight, he said, "This operation is proceeding in a thoroughly satisfactory manner." The House cheered.
The Channel at dawn was thick with ships, an armada carrying the invaders to France. 4,000 vessels with a host of smaller craft to attend them. Nelson would have approved. It was Dunkirk in reverse, a naval assemblage without precedent. A relentless bombardment of German shore defences prepared the way for the landings, a nightmare of Allied naval guns volleying and thundering, shelling that continued through the day. Time to go. After a quick breakfast, it was over the side and into a landing craft for thousands upon thousands of men. Each British soldier kitted out like a pack horse with ammunition and supplies. For these men, the trail had already been blazed. Sappers and special units had been ashore for hours clearing mines and booby traps, usually under fire. Flotillas of landing craft shuttled to and fro from the transports, putting men ashore. Months of planning come to fruition on what Normans call the mother-of-pearl coast. The British and Canadian assault area, cheek by jowl with the American, spanned 24 miles of Normandy coastline. Almost 25,000 soldiers were landed today in one British sector alone. That is a measure of the size of this invasion. German shore defences went up in smoke as they were overwhelmed. The famed Atlantic Wall was not, after all, impenetrable. Tonight, the build-up continued. Not only men, of course, but tanks by the 100, vehicles by the 1,000, and mountains of stores. The fighting by evening was mostly inland, with Caen and Bayeux clearly the main strategic targets. As the din of battle faded on the beaches, it was a moment for reflection by the Allied Naval Chief, Admiral Ramsay. We have broken the crust and caught the enemy napping. It seemed a fair conclusion. Veterans of Dunkirk rejoice.
BBC correspondents are with every arm of the liberating forces. Soon after the assault began, their reports started to reach London. The BBC's Colin Wills was on board one of the landing craft.
This is the day and this is the hour. The sky is lightening over the coast of Europe as we go in. But along the shore, there's a dense smoke screen as the battleships and the warships, the smaller warships, sweep along there, firing all the time against the shore, and some of them laying a smoke screen for us. The whole sky is bright, the sea is a glittering mass of silver, with all these craft of every kind moving across it, and the great battleships in the background blazing away at the shore.
Before the troops went ashore, there'd been a huge aerial bombardment by more than 2,000 British and American aircraft. And stretching across 200 miles of sky went another 1,000 aircraft and gliders carrying troops. Mr. Churchill said the airborne landings were on a far larger scale than anything that has ever been seen. We have two reports.
As the invasion fleet set sail, Supreme Allied Commander General Eisenhower told his troops, "Don't worry about the planes overhead, they'll be ours." And they were. Wave after wave of aircraft wearing their new D-Day zebra stripes could be seen passing over the fleet. They provided the most gigantic air umbrella ever seen. Between midnight and 8 a.m., more than 31,000 British, American and other Allied airmen were over France. They remained virtually unopposed by the German Luftwaffe. During the day, 1,300 heavy bombers from the US 8th and 9th Air Forces and hundreds more medium and fighter bombers delivered their deadly loads in support of the landings. They'd been preceded by the British Bomber Command's heavies, unloading more than 5,000 tons of bombs, the biggest single night raid of the war to date. The Allies' flying artillery, RAF Typhoons and American Thunderbolt ground attack fighters, were out in swarms, marauding and strafing their way deep into France, blitzing German troop trains, smashing depots and disrupting communications. Many Luftwaffe planes were caught on the ground and destroyed.
It was an historic mission these men prepared for last night, camouflaging themselves and their kit. They were to be the largest airborne invasion force ever, more than 20,000 men, a force launched just 7 seconds after midnight. The vanguard was a fleet of over 800 gliders, towed by transport planes and bombers in the dead of night, and released at 5,000 feet to silently swoop towards their designated landing zones. The first 6 gliders carried Allied troops who seized the Caen Canal and Orne River bridges within 5 minutes of landing. But there were inevitably tragedies, as gliders landed in darkness, trying to avoid the stakes, nicknamed Rommel's asparagus, driven into the ground to foil them. Behind the gliders, the second wave, 1,000 planes which carried the paratroopers of the British 6th and the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. The faces of the men aboard betrayed their apprehension, but when it was time to go, there was no hesitation. The air was thick with parachutes unfolding. The airborne armada stretched across 200 miles of sky. Their mission was to disrupt German defences along the beachhead at Normandy, to provide support for Allied troops landing from the sea. Reports so far indicate soldiers were landed with great precision. Despite losses, their achievement has been to bring confusion and uncertainty to the German forces on the Cherbourg Peninsula.
This afternoon, the King and the Prime Minister visited SHAEF, the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, where they met the Supreme Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower. And tonight, from Buckingham Palace, His Majesty has broadcast to Britain and to the United States. Once more, he said, a supreme test had to be faced, and he called the nation to prayer.
At this historic moment, surely not one of us is too busy, too young, or too old to play a part in a nationwide, a worldwide vigil of prayer as the great crusade sets forth. And the Lord will give strength unto his people, and the Lord will give his people the blessing of peace.
News of the invasion was first picked up on German radio at 6 o'clock this morning. Since the first official news of the landing was given just after 9:30 this morning, people have been waiting for details in a state of mounting excitement. Newspapers have been snapped up as soon as they've gone on sale. The Prime Minister has said it is much the greatest thing we have ever attempted. A report now on the secret preparations for D-Day.
By last week,
13,000 aircraft, including bombers, fighters, transport planes and gliders, have been assembled. And in concealed locations in the south of England, tens of thousands of tanks, vehicles and artillery pieces were ready for embarkation. As all kinds of equipment could be seen rumbling through tiny village streets, a major problem was to make sure that everyone involved in the operation knew what to do and where to do it without breaching security. The channel is now more or less sealed at its western and eastern ends by destroyers, frigates and smaller vessels. At secret ports along the coast, more than 7,000 warships and merchant ships had for weeks been on standby. Eventually, an estimated 500,000 troops will be needed in France. As the first units went aboard, few of the men knew exactly where they were going. Some remained at sea for more than 24 hours before they received their final landing orders, experiencing terrible seasickness in some of the worst June weather in the Channel during the last 40 years. All hospitals in southern England have been put on standby for the inevitable casualties expected during this biggest invasion ever mounted.
In Berlin, the Germans have referred to what they call the long-expected Allied attack. Hitler's generals are predicting that the invasion will be a fiasco. In the United States, the mood is solemn. When the landings were announced, people at work stopped for prayer. And for the first time since the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, all the lights on the Statue of Liberty have been illuminated. On American radio, President Roosevelt has asked listeners to join him in a prayer that he wrote himself last night for the success of the invasion and for the men who are crossing the Channel.
Some will never return. Embrace these, Father, and receive them, thy heroic servants, into thy kingdom. And for us at home, fathers, mothers, children, wives, sisters, and brothers of brave men overseas, whose thoughts and prayers are ever with them, help us, Almighty God, to rededicate ourselves in renewed faith in Thee in this hour of great sacrifice.
No reports have as yet been received about the American landings. The weather tonight in the Channel is unsettled. There is a strong northwesterly wind, heavy cloud and rain with little sign of moderation. So tonight, British forces joined by American and Canadian troops are back in France. In his broadcast this morning, the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, said the landings were but the opening phase of the campaign. Great battles, he said, lay ahead. And last night, before the Armada set sail, General Montgomery told his men, "To us is given the honor of striking a blow for freedom, which will live in history." And that was the news tonight, the 6th of June, 1944, D-Day. From the BBC in London, good night. Good evening. The headlines tonight, the 7th of June, 1944. Allied forces have control of the landing beaches. The town of Bayeux has been captured. But German resistance is growing and there's fierce fighting around Caen. We now know that the Americans suffered heavy losses yesterday as they went ashore. The Allied bombing offensive has switched to targets inland. In the birthday honours, there's a knighthood for Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin. And the latest portal house has been unveiled. A new mode of living, or is it too low and too small?
Of course it is small, but the planning is good. And the house could easily be worked and would be most economical to run.
Heavy fighting is taking place along the Normandy coast. Huge Allied reinforcements of men and equipment have been landed on the invasion beaches. German resistance is growing, but the Allies are believed to have achieved their first significant success. The town of Bayeux has surrendered to the Allies this evening, and the main Bayeux to Caen road has been blocked at several points. But according to German reports, the Allied advance towards Caen itself has been halted. American forces are advancing inland from 2 beaches further west towards the Cherbourg Peninsula. It's now known that the United States First Army suffered heavy casualties yesterday while trying to gain a foothold on one of those beaches. We have 2 reports, beginning with yesterday's American landings.
American warships began bombardment at 6:30 yesterday morning, 40 minutes before their landings on the eastern beachhead. But when the men came ashore, it was clear German defences had survived intact. Heavy and intense fire was targeted on the troops as they disembarked from the landing craft, seasick and overloaded. Many were cut down before they reached the sand. Others fled back into the water. The aim had been to secure a landing strip some 7,000 yards wide, but the sea was rougher than expected, the resistance more savage. Under vicious German gunfire, the US 5 Corps sustained staggering losses. 15 minutes after landing, the entire A Company was out of action. Others lost up to 70% of their men and officers, killed outright. There was no advance, no order, no communications. For 2 hours, it appeared this landing was a major disaster. But as the morning wore on, fortunes changed. British and American warships moved closer in to blast the German artillery. Some reinforcements managed to land, and the shocked survivors from the initial carnage began to regroup. By afternoon, they had cleared most of the German trenches and taken prisoners from the artillery emplacements. The resistance was cracking. As the US troops fought their way to the cliffs, the extent of the casualties became clearer. Tonight, reports are coming in of more than 2,000 dead. Already, many of the wounded are back on board ship, bound for the south coast. Against all odds and expectations, there is now an eastern beachhead under firm US control, but the cost has been nothing less than tragic.
British troops fighting their way south from the invasion beaches into the outskirts of Bayeux found that the bulk of German forces had pulled out earlier in the day, leaving a scattering of snipers to harry the invader. Each had to be winkled out. Bayeux, home of the celebrated medieval tapestry, is a prize, the first sizable French town to be freed from Hitler's yoke. More to the point today, for the advancing soldiery of British 30 Corps, Bayeux is a strategically important junction of 7 roads. Elsewhere, it was largely a day of holding captured ground, except at the east end of the British-Canadian sector round Caen. Allied military sources say that this substantial Norman town is the key to the success of British-Canadian operations. Caen is surrounded by open country, and German army units there are well dug in. A column of British tanks filmed here coming out to take a breather after a day of hard fighting had been stopped at Le Bizet, a tiny hamlet just 3 miles short of Caen. They'd found themselves up against the cracked 21st German Panzer Division. Nobody has got much closer than Le Bizet, despite reports to the contrary. German strategic reserves, for sure, are on the way. Rommel's counter-offensive has yet to come.
The huge airborne assault is continuing behind enemy lines. One of those who crash-landed by glider in last night's first invasion was the BBC's Chester Wilmot. He sent us this report.
He put the nose down. We stiffened ourselves for the jolt of the touchdown and lifted our feet clear of the floor in case something might rip through the belly. The touchdown itself was perfect, but as the wheels bounced and lurched over the furrows and ditches, we heard the harsh straining of the wooden fuselage, the crash of posts hitting the nose and undercarriage. Then a last-minute lurch and swerve to the right as the pilot swung our glider clear of the water safely. No one was even scratched. We shouted with joy and relief and bundled out into the field. Around us we could see the silhouettes of other gliders, twisted and wrecked, making grotesque patterns against the sky. Some had buried their noses in the soil. Others had lost a wheel or a wing. One had crashed into a house. Two had crashed into each other. And yet as we marched off past these twists and for our own good fortune, other troops were clambering out of almost every one of these as casually as they might leave a bus.
Allied fighter bombers are now conducting a round-the-clock attack on centres of communication, including Caen. French civilians are fleeing into the countryside. Our warships continue to add to the bombardment, engaging inland targets behind the beaches.
Once again last night, even earlier than usual, the RAF's heavy bombers set off into the darkness against the Germans. But there's been a switch in bomber tactics, away from the coast, inland, to try blocking German reinforcements being brought up to the battle. Overnight, more than 1,000 RAF Lancasters, Halifaxes and Mosquitoes hit towns and other centres of communication in Normandy. Places like Lisieux and Coutances were particularly badly damaged. Vire and Saint-Lô had their town centres destroyed. In some areas, the bombers ran into heavy German flak. Around Caen, German anti-aircraft gunners hammered away at the waves of planes passing overhead. 6 of the 11 British bombers lost last night were shot down in this attack. During the day, American liberators and marauders continued the relentless aerial assault. Inevitably, the targeting of towns and rail and road junctions means that many French civilians have been hit as well. For the French, this taste of being bombed in order to be liberated will have been a bitter one. Although the Allies have dropped thousands of leaflets urging civilians to stay away from German military concentrations, it's accepted by Allied headquarters that there will have been many French casualties. At Caen, where the invasion force has hit tough German resistance, much of the old town, where William the Conqueror lies buried, was ablaze. Many refugees are fleeing. In Caen, it's estimated that well over 1,000 civilians were killed in the raids.
The German High Command has conceded that the Allied operation has gained a foothold. Their news agency has said that the bridgehead is now up to 8 miles deep and 20 miles wide. A commentator on German radio reported that German defences have been very heavily taxed. In Paris, the Germans have declared a state of emergency. Parks have been turned into detention camps and thousands of people are said to have been arrested. Broadcasts by the Vichy government, the French government collaborating with the Germans, are telling the French to stay at home and not get involved.
The news of the Allied landings in Normandy reached the citizens of occupied Paris in a broadcast on Vichy radio yesterday. Only the German communiqué was delivered. There was no immediate comment from the Vichy leaders. But later in the day, the head of the Vichy regime, Marshal Pétain, responded to President Eisenhower's broadcast with his own radio address. He urged French people to stay in their posts and maintain essential services.
La France devient ainsi un champ de bataille. Français, n'aggravez pas nos malheurs par des actes qui risqueraient d'appeler sur vous de tragiques représailles. Les circonstances de la bataille pourront conduire l'armée allemande à prendre des dispositions spéciales dans les zones de combat. Acceptez cette nécessité.
This message was reiterated in a second Vichy broadcast, which stated that French citizens should not take orders from an American general. The broadcast was made by Pétain's deputy, Laval. 2 days before the landings, the leader of the Free French, currently in exile, General Charles de Gaulle, arrived in London. Yesterday, de Gaulle broadcast to the French people, rallying them to action.
La bataille suprême est engagée. Après tant de combats, de fureur, de douleur, voici venu le choc décisif, le choc tant espéré.
In Paris, it is not immediately clear which call will win the most support over the next few days. The Vichy government enjoys little popular support. In view of the emergency, it is now considering plans to conscript all young people to be employed on public works. At the same time, many French people are not yet convinced that the Allies can triumph.
New medicines are available to help the wounded returning from the D-Day beaches. And today, in the King's Birthday Honours List, there are knighthoods for the two men who developed penicillin, the new drug which fights infection. Professor Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928. It was developed for medical use by Professor H.W. Florey of Oxford University. Penicillin is now being widely used to treat war casualties, and it's been announced that the bulk of the drug supplies are being reserved for the use of the armed forces. The latest model of the Portal prefabricated house has gone on show. Named after the Minister of Works, Lord Portal, earlier models of the house have been strongly criticised by the people who will have to live in them as too small, too narrow, too noisy and too low.
Britain's first factory-made show house, prototype of the $500,000 promised by Mr. Churchill as emergency dwellings for demobilised servicemen and their families. Bright idea number one is the living room fireplace, which also provides heated air for 2 bedrooms. This house of the future has no stairs, no dust-collecting wainscoting, and is intended to last about 10 years. Plenty of built-in cupboards are a welcomed feature. Married women on the staff of the Ministry of Works helped in the design. The kitchen is compact, but the initial blueprint didn't provide sufficient facilities for washing clothes. They're going to fix a small copper now in the bathroom. The refrigerator tops the list of the £80 worth of internal fittings built into Churchill Villa. Bedroom number 2 also has plenty of cupboards and, like the other rooms, is central heated. Housewives will want to know where to hang the washing in wet weather, and many may criticize the width of the hall. But here's one opinion.
I think it is very good indeed. For a small house for the men who are coming home and the women who have been working hard in the factories and want to get back to family life, I think it is an ideal house.
Letters are already on their way to servicemen fighting in France, according to the Army Postal Service. The GPO rates for mail are a penny for a card and 3 halfpence for a letter. Finally, the weather conditions in the Channel are brighter. The strong northwesterly wind has moderated. The sea is calmer. And that was the news tonight, the 7th of June 1944. D-Day +1, as the Allied armies started to move on into France from their Normandy beachheads. From the BBC, good night. Good evening. The headlines tonight, the 8th of June 1944. Strong German counterattacks are blocking the British and Canadian armies outside Caen. German panzer divisions have been brought up to reinforce the town. Supreme headquarters say the crucial stage of the battle is approaching. Mr. Churchill has warned against over-optimism. He says enormous exertions lie ahead. After their early setbacks, American troops are advancing. There's fierce fighting around the town of Isigny. There's been a row about class in the Lords after a Tory said public schools produced better, braver soldiers. And Private Pigeon is playing his part in the Allied advance. D-Day +2 and the British-Canadian advance seems to have stalled. The Allies haven't been pushed back, but strong German counterattacks are preventing our forces from moving forward. The battle, according to Supreme Allied headquarters, has entered a crucial phase. British and Canadian forces are now holding a beachhead nearly 40 miles wide. Fierce fighting is taking place around Caen, which came under sustained Allied bombardment today. To the west, American troops are advancing towards the town of Isigny. We have 2 reports in a moment on the American advance, but first, the German counterattack against the British Second Army around Caen.
Extraordinary film in the circumstances and revealing. For although we see a German army in apparent good fettle and counter-attacking fiercely today to stem the Allied advance, the impression abides among seasoned military observers that the redoubtable Rommel is still unable to mount a major counter-offensive against the Allied invasion. The Germans continued today to hold off Allied units trying to capture Caen, but Rommel clearly has his problems. He has elements of 3 crack panzer divisions around the town. The 12th SS, seen here on film, heavily camouflaged against air attack, but not yet seemingly at full strength. The Panzer Lehr, rated the best tank division in the German army, and the 21st Panzer Division, an elite unit from Rommel's old Afrika Corps, at full strength, protecting Caen with tanks, infantry and mobile guns. 2 of these divisions, the 12th SS and the 21st, today made what looked like a concerted effort to break through to the sea. It produced the roughest tank clash of the invasion so far. Canadian and German tanks were eyeball to eyeball. Canadians lost tanks and prisoners. We see a paratroop lieutenant here and troops from the North Nova Scotia Highlanders. What we don't see is what today's fighting cost the Germans. Their wrecked tanks, their prisoners, their dead. They are still, despite appearances, strategically on the defensive, and today's counterattack failed.
Despite appalling losses on the eastern beachhead 2 days ago, the Americans are pushing on. The supply operation is running more smoothly as units press inland, knocking out the German artillery positions which caused such devastation during the initial assault. Advance units of 5 Corps are making the running, inflicting some heavy losses in their drive south. German forces have now been pushed back across the strategically vital River Our. The Americans' immediate goal, the town of Isigny, where fierce fighting is already underway on the outskirts. They now seem likely to take it in the early hours of the morning, but it's already clear the town has taken a massive pounding. Streets and houses were today badly damaged by concerted Allied bombardment. For the Americans, Isigny is a key objective. With it comes control of key roads and bridges. The US advance depends on taking it. During the day, German prisoners were seized in the approach to the town, their forces caught unawares by the speed and direction of the US advance. Nonetheless, all units were warned to prepare for enemy counterattacks after reinforcements were sighted some 70 miles south of the battlefront. The Americans are making good use of their new supplies. 6 artillery battalions are moving into position for the attack. It's hard to imagine such a radical improvement in US fortunes. Tonight, they aim to punch a corridor between their 2 bridgeheads and spearhead the Allied drive south. The advance is in second gear and looks hard to stop.
In the House of Commons, the Prime Minister, Mr. Churchill, has given a strong warning against over-optimism. The Prime Minister surprised the House by not making a detailed statement about the fighting. He said he would not be doing so unless there were what he called exceptional circumstances. And then he urged MPs to go to their constituencies and maintain morale. Mr. Churchill said people should not think that matters would be settled quickly. Although great dangers lie behind, enormous exertions lie before us, he said. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower, has said that all troops are performing magnificently. Yesterday, he held a conference on board a British warship with General Montgomery and Admiral Ramsay, the Allied Naval Commander. Today, General Montgomery went ashore for the first time to take personal command of the Allied armies. He says he is very well satisfied with the general situation. The BBC's Michael Standing was on one of those beaches earlier today. Here now is his report on the operation to reinforce the Allied advance.
The build-up is going well. I spent some hours on the beaches this morning watching men, food, ammunition and supplies come streaming in. It's a combined operation between Navy, Army and Merchant Navy. The effort is enormous, the results in some cases staggering. Up and down those lanes, almost as though on conveyor belts, the regular steady stream of ducks was moving. Hundreds of them. They went out empty from the shore, changed from wheel drive to propeller a few yards out, and made tracks, or rather wakes, for the merchantmen lying 2 or 3 miles out to sea. Down the next door lane, they were coming inshore, reversing the process and driving their piled cargoes of sugar crates, tires, petrol, shells up the coast road to the depots.
And now some home news, and the new education bill proposed by Mr R.A. Butler, which will introduce far-reaching reforms in our schools, was given a second reading by the House of Lords today. But there were angry words after one Conservative peer suggested that public schools produced better soldiers than elementary schools.
If the Duke of Wellington believed the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton, that argument was pushed to its limit in the upper house by Lord Buckmaster. His suggestion that public schoolboys were more responsible and could bear punishment with greater fortitude than elementary school children drew a sharp response from Lord Latham. It was untrue, Lord Latham retorted, that those who had been to public school had more courage. Such statements were entirely indefensible and offensive to the bulk of those who are serving this country in the forces in the cause of freedom and liberty. The clash in the House of Lords points to the underlying debate over Mr Butler's education bill. At present, only 3 out of every 100 children enjoy the privilege of a private education, which continues after the age of 11. In the state sector, local education authorities are obliged to provide elementary education only, although some already provide more. The new bill aims to provide state secondary education for all those aged 11 or more. The school leaving age is to be raised to 15 and eventually to 16. Technical education is to be made available to produce a range of skills for contemporary society. And each school must start the day with religious assembly, the first time this has been made compulsory. The education bill has had a difficult progress in wartime. There's been opposition from Conservative forces within Mr Butler's own party to this perceived erosion of elitism. The new bill is being presented as a crucial part of the framework for post-war society. Today, the House of Lords gave it its second reading without a division. Winding up for the government, Lord Selborne, the Minister of Economic Warfare, said Mr Butler had started the country forward on the road of educational progress.
Today is the King's official birthday. His Majesty spent the day quietly at Buckingham Palace. This afternoon, he and the Queen went to Downing Street for tea with the Prime Minister and Mrs Churchill. Recently, the King and Queen met the crew of an American bomber, which is today in the news.
During a tour of American Army Air Force bases, the King and Queen met the men who fly the Memphis Belle, the first flying fortress to complete 25 missions over enemy territory. During her combat tour, the B-17 has been hit by every type of anti-aircraft fire. Having survived, she and her crew have a very different target in their sights. They're flying home as celebrities to raise money for the American war bond drive as a film about their mission opens at the Empire Cinema in London today. The colour documentary shows what it's like flying daylight raids over Germany. The teamwork of the 10-man crew comes over graphically. Last month alone, over 200 American and British bombers were reported missing. It will be an honourable retirement, and the bomber is assured of star treatment.
Nearly 1,000 people who've helped the war effort on the home front are in the second half of the King's birthday honours list. They include British Empire medals for foster mothers who've taken in evacuees, and others such as parachute makers and censors and black market breakers. There's also an MBE for the holiday camp founder, Mr W.E. Billy Butlin, for his work in advising the Ministry of Supply on hostels. Supreme Allied Headquarters has been revealing details of some of the success stories of D-Day. Allied tanks were waterproofed so that they could drive ashore through up to 6 feet of water. Troops have been going ashore with special folding bicycles, while news from Normandy has, quite literally, been winging its way back to Britain.
Some of the first armour ashore consisted of Major General Percy Hobart's funnies. For any troops who had served in the desert, the appearance of the flail tank, the Crab, was a welcome sight. It was used successfully at El Alamein. Flailing 3 feet into the ground, it's designed to clear mines for infantry and light vehicles to follow. It will prove invaluable on the hard drive to the strategically important town of Caen. Less spectacular is transport used during the Great War, the bicycle. In a major effort towards mobility, folding bikes and mini power cycles have been developed. First reports suggest that in spite of trials, riding bikes with full battle kit is at best a precarious way of getting about. It is thought that bikes will be more useful by the time second and third echelon troops, especially medics, get ashore in secure areas. Communications have been aided by carrier pigeons, kept in a special canister while being parachuted in with the airborne troops. The birds carry messages and position reports back to their bases in England. There are also reports that some dead pigeons carrying false messages have been dropped near German lines to confuse the enemy. But the truly leading light of the initial assault seems to have been two midget submarines, the so-called X-craft, first launched in March of last year. Naval staff suggest that 4 days before D-Day, two of the 50-feet-long boats, X-20 and X-23, left Portsmouth, commanded by two Australian volunteer reserve officers. They then lay off the French coast for 76 hours, 64 of them on the sea bottom, awaiting the invasion. When the assault began, they surfaced and flashed their green lights to guide in British and Canadian landing forces.
Finally, some news from other war fronts. The Germans say Russian forces in northwest Romania have opened a new front north of the Nazi-held base of Jassy. In Italy, the Fifth Army has captured Civita Castellana, 30 miles north of Rome, while the Eighth Army, moving up the Tiber Valley, has taken Subiaco. And in northwest India, Japanese forces are withdrawing south from Kohima, pursued by the British. And that was the news tonight, the 8th of June 1944, as British and Canadian forces try to move out from the beachheads in Normandy in the face of a gathering German counterattack. From the BBC, good night. Good evening. The headlines tonight, the 9th of June 1944. German resistance to the British and Canadian forces is strengthening. There's bitter fighting along the entire Normandy front. The battle for Caen is intensifying. American forces are advancing towards Cherbourg. They've finally taken Saint-Mère-Église. In the race to reinforce the battlefront, the Allies are towing artificial harbours to Normandy. General Eisenhower has issued a proclamation to the people of France.
Ici, Londres. Les Français parlent aux Français.
People of Western Europe, I have this message for all of you. Although the initial assault may not have been made in your own country, the hour of your liberation is approaching.
And good news about food. We're producing more, and there'll be few cuts in rations this year. Allied forces have continued to advance from the Normandy beaches, but they are facing increasingly strong German resistance. 10 German divisions have been identified, including more tank reinforcements. A major battle is taking place at Caen, which still hasn't been captured. But British tanks and infantry are making progress south of Bayeux. And there's progress too on the Cherbourg Peninsula, where American forces have finally secured the town of Saint-Mère-Église, where they first landed by parachute during the early hours of D-Day. They've blocked off the main roads and the railway line from Carentan to Cherbourg, and they've captured Isigny.
The town of Isigny burned late into the night, falling finally towards dawn as US forces entered the city to minimal resistance. For several hours, though, the streets echoed to the sound of sniper rifles and the returning fire from the Americans. This town was the boost they needed, a vital staging post from which a corridor can be opened between the two US bridgeheads. To the population, though, liberation has meant destruction. There isn't much left to salvage. We're now seeing the start of the second phase of the beachhead operations, a more concerted drive aimed at cutting off the Cherbourg Peninsula. All day yesterday, fighting intensified around Saint-Mère-Église. It was the first town liberated on D-Day, but has remained since then in contention. Men of the 82nd Airborne Division have held it against repeated German counterattack from the south. Today, though, the enemy units were finally beaten back, and the town belonged to America. Artillery battles had raged through the night, causing substantial damage. By morning, it was clear German casualties had been heavy. For strategic and psychological reasons, this was a town the Americans had to hold as the heavy fighting continues across northern France. Further east, British and Canadian forces are making some progress south of Bayeux, but have yet to penetrate defences around the strategically important town of Caen. Here, the tank battles continued unabated, with the Allies facing some of the strongest panzer units in France. To combat them, Monty's two crack desert divisions are moving into the battlefront. But even so, the prospect of Caen falling soon is bleak.
The English Channel was calmer today, and that meant that men and supplies were unloaded on the beaches in even greater quantity. Already more than 300,000 men have landed, and now artificial harbours called mulberries are being taken across to Normandy to make docking easier.
Towed across the channel in segments, 2 mulberry harbours, the size of Dover, are expected to be assembled within the next few days. The operation will involve more than 40,000 troops. Each harbour will be able to handle up to 7 7,000-ton cargo ships and 12 coasters a day. Planners say that the ports of Cherbourg, Brest and Lorient are heavily defended and will be severely damaged by the time they fall into Allied hands. Without the new artificial harbours, the Allies would be less able to keep up their resupply of the invading armies during the coming weeks. The high priority given to the speedy assembly of the mulberries is just one reminder that while the main focus is always on frontline troops, it is in fact logistics which decide battles and wars. For example, just one infantry division needs 700 tons of supplies a day. Since the first equipment was landed on D-Day, the management of the beachheads has run into considerable problems. There's been a shortage of storage space and almost instant congestion on the beaches. Many follow-on units were unable to move inland because the advanced forces had failed to press on. By this time next week, commanders anticipate having landed more than 500,000 men, more than 80,000 vehicles, and about 180,000 tons of stores. However, unless the current pace of supplying the beaches can be increased, the Allied advance is in danger of grinding to a halt.
The Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower, has issued a proclamation to the people of France. It's been broadcast and printed on leaflets, thousands of which have been dropped by Allied aircraft. In it, General Eisenhower says the Allied forces will destroy the Nazi tyranny root and branch, so that the peoples of Europe may have a new birth of freedom. He warns the French people of further deprivation, and to collaborators, he says, those who have made common cause with the enemy will be removed.
In his proclamation, which was displayed in the liberated French towns, General Eisenhower urged the French people to lend every resource to help the Allies, although that effort might inflict further suffering on France. He promised that French citizens would be free to choose their own government, but significantly made no mention of the leader of the Free French, General Charles de Gaulle. Over the past days, French civilians, women, children and old people, but few men of military age, have been out to greet Allied troops. But many were surprised by the arrival of British and American soldiers, since in some areas the Germans had seized all radio sets. However, their welcome to the soldiers has frequently been low-key, even reserved, compared to that in other liberated countries. The people are grateful for food supplies, and the children haven't seen such sweets for years, but some soldiers have noted that food seems plentiful in parts of Normandy, and the people generally not malnourished. The French, for their part, are surprised to hear of rationing in Britain. From anonymity are now emerging the French resistance groups, the Maquis. Once out of hiding, they wear their insignia, red, white and blue armbands endorsed with the Cross of Lorraine. Many carry weapons which have been dropped by parachute from British planes. 3,000 members of the resistance are thought to have been active in Normandy. Their contribution to the Allied landings was a wave of sabotage to railways, bridges and telephone links, coordinated by British intelligence and triggered by code phrases broadcast on the BBC. The ravages of war have muted the response of the people of Normandy to liberation. Bombing has left the people numbed. Their towns are devastated. Thousands of civilians have lost their lives. For 4 years, they have survived under Nazi oppression. Now they are paying a heavy price for their freedom.
In Berlin, the mood is said to be sombre. The German people have been told to expect a second Allied invasion. The German newspaper, the Völkische Beobachter, said today that the decisive battle for Europe is underway, which, if it is lost, would, it says, mean the end of Germany. Lord Haw-Haw, the traitor William Joyce, broadcast today from Germany. As usual, he was cutting across a British wavelength, but unusually for him, he was sounding uncertain about the outcome of the invasion.
Since it is obvious to all competent observers on both sides that the campaign is likely to be both complex and gradual in its development. For example, it is no secret that the Allies have as yet engaged only a portion of the forces allocated to the great enterprise, whilst it is equally clear that the great strategic reserves which Germany has built up in the West will be applied to the operations only when circumstances warrant their application.
The voice of the traitor William Joyce. So far, more than 4,000 German troops have been captured. They've been sent back across the Channel. Those thought to possess special information have been sent up to the London cage, as it's called, for questioning. The others are being sent to POW camps around the country.
As the Allied advance continues, the number of German prisoners is steadily increasing. Their faces reflect the horror of battle and the indignity of capture. Thousands are marched to the beachheads. They reflect the mixed quality of the enemy forces, from proud, unrepentant officers to dejected young conscripts. Many of them slave troops taken from Russia, Poland, even Mongolia. The evacuation plans encompass not only our own wounded, but injured POWs too. They've been gathered on Normandy's beaches, awaiting transport to Britain. There's plenty of room aboard the hundreds of vessels pressed into service for the invasion. Their captains only too eager to have such a cargo for the return trip. The swelling tide of prisoners is causing logjams in the coastal towns which receive them. Officers are segregated from other ranks, and trains take the prisoners to 4 locations in northern England or 2 in Scotland. Those who might well have valuable inside information on German military plans and deployment are sent to what's known as the London cage. Under the Geneva Convention, interrogation is forbidden, but government sources indicate they have evidence Hitler is flouting the rules of war in his treatment of Allied prisoners. A makeshift internment camp has been set up here at Kempton Park. It's filling up fast with bewildered young Germans who know it's all over, not only for them, but perhaps for their country too.
Britain's food stocks are good. The Minister of Food, Colonel J.J. Llewellyn, told the House of Commons today that, with the exception of milk, there should be no cut in rations this year.
Colonel Llewellyn said that the nation's health had been maintained, although there was some loss of middle-age spread. This news was greeted by cheers and laughter. Youngsters were actually putting on weight. The infant mortality rate was lower than ever before. Ration books were being distributed very efficiently by the local food offices. It could take as little as 15 seconds for a new ration book to be issued. On the whole, he wished to maintain existing rations for the remainder of the year, but there were a few changes. Milk is to be reduced from 4 pints to 3 per week. The cheese ration, however, will be raised from 2 ounces to 3 ounces per week. An extra pound of sugar per person per week will be issued for jam making. Carrots must not be sold at more than 6p a pound, and it was hoped that the price would go down to 4p halfpenny. The price of bread would be maintained, but it was never to exceed 9p for a £4 loaf. Dehydration, Colonel Llewellyn said, was a horrid word, and this was greeted with cheers, but a wonderful process. Now there is an entirely new product on the market, mashed potato powder. Winding up, the minister congratulated housewives on their ingenuity. But beware, he said, spam was spam, even though restaurants might call it jambon de Strasbourg aux endives. Later in the debate, the Conservative member for Aberdeen, Mr. Robert Boothby, took issue about the quality of bread. He said that the two great pleasures he looked forward to on the day the war ended was first to pull up all the blackout blinds and for the lights to shine out at night, and second that the government will no longer be in a position to force filthy brown bread down the throats of the people of this country against their will.
The Home Secretary, Mr. Herbert Morrison, has disclosed that so far the war has cost the United Kingdom some £19,000 million. Speaking in Norwich, Mr. Morrison said the government had spent more than twice the amount expended on the First World War. The weather in the Channel is worsening tonight with low cloud, mist and rain, though sea conditions are said to be moderating. Supreme Allied Headquarters has said that the landing of supplies is continuing despite the unfavourable conditions. Reinforcements are going ashore, and tonight large numbers of Royal Air Force bombers are once again heading for France as the battle along the Normandy beachhead reaches a critical phase. That was the news tonight, the 9th of June 1944. From the BBC, good night. Good evening. The headlines tonight, the 10th of June 1944. Allied forces have linked up across the battlefront in Normandy. They now form a solid front more than 50 miles wide and up to 10 miles deep. Enemy counterattacks are all being resisted. Our planes are now operating from landing strips in France. Our correspondent Richard Dimbleby has flown over the battlefront.
In front of the great mass of shipping, there's the great pattern of France, cratered and re-cratered where our bombs have fallen in the past.
The wounded are returning from Normandy with their stories of the battle. And work has begun on building a new airport for London. It's at a village called Heathrow. 5 days on from D-Day, and stage 1 of the Allied operation is complete. A 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coast, a lodgement area as it's known, has been occupied. The area runs from the north of Caen, where strong German tank forces are still resisting the British and Canadians, across to Bayeux and the newly captured town of Isigny, where the American forces have now linked up with one another, and then westwards into the Cherbourg Peninsula, where German resistance is said to be beginning to break. American forces are believed to be within 18 miles of Cherbourg itself. But the greatest battle is the one for Caen, where British heavy armour is facing Hitler's elite panzer divisions.
As these pictures show, Rommel's plan to push the Allies back into the sea has failed. But at this stage, the meeting of British and American troops is symbolic rather than strategic. The bitterest fighting is away from the beachheads, and there's much more to come. These tanks, virtually trapped in lanes hemmed in by 12-foot banks and 3-foot hedges, indicate that the battle is not going as planned. In this terrain, German ambushes are easy to mount and effective. A lead tank knocked out holds up the whole column. Even in the best cases, the line of sight is limited to 400 yards. Mortar attack is particularly devastating. And because of the close fighting in this so-called Bocage territory, casualties are high. Ammunition, in particular grenades, are being used at an unexpectedly fast rate. Consequently, the advance has so far not matched the original forecast. Although some columns of German armour have been knocked out by Allied planes, the newly arrived elite Panzer-Lehr division is providing formidable opposition. They are now defending the small towns around Tilly-sur-Seine, southwest of Caen. The British 50th Division is trying to penetrate the Panzer-Lehr. All morning long-range bombardment by Royal Navy battleships and cruisers has helped the 50th Division to take some of the small villages around Tilly, although Tilly itself remains in German hands. General Montgomery's plan was to secure the beachheads, force the Germans into a tactical withdrawal, and then break out on both flanks. The Germans are not performing to Monty's script. As we approach the end of the first week of this invasion, there is a sense that the Allied commanders may have chosen Normandy for its favourable landing sites, not for its battlefields.
Allied planes are now operating from airfields inside France, and fighters and fighter bombers have been out again attacking the German supply lines. In the last 5 days, more than 30,000 sorties have been flown.
Since the initial landings, a high Allied priority has been to create makeshift airstrips that would greatly extend the range of the fighter bombers. As of today, the RAF is again operational from French soil. So are Mustangs from the 9th US Air Force. Ground crews were arming Typhoons of the RAF's flying artillery for rocket strafing, in which they've been excelling all week. Together with the Americans, they've flown tens of thousands of sorties, blasting rail yards, wrecking trains, and crippling rail links the Germans are desperately trying to use to bring up panzer reinforcements from the south and the east. Only hours ago, Typhoons of 83 Group attacked the headquarters of German Panzer Group West, reportedly killing several senior officers. And all week, the so-called cab-rank rocket brigade have turned much of northern France into a shooting alley, blitzing German airfields, road convoys, bridges, fuel dumps, tank columns, and even here, a command staff car. But the Luftwaffe has at last been putting in an appearance. It seems that during the first days of the invasion, German fighters have been deployed to defend the fatherland against Allied air raids. Those Luftwaffe planes that took off today were soon pounced on by RAF interceptors and shot down. In all, the Luftwaffe has lost 200 planes this week. Allied air superiority over the battlefield has rarely been more supreme.
Wounded Allied troops have been arriving back at south coast ports. It's impossible to estimate the number of casualties during the first 5 days of the invasion, but it's probable that more than 10,000 British, Canadian and American troops have been killed, wounded or are missing.
As the German response has hardened, Allied casualties are mounting, but so too is the operation to treat and evacuate them as speedily as possible. On the beaches, rail tracks carry the victims of the seaborne invasion back to the water's edge. Here, landing ships fitted out as floating hospitals wait to take them to safety. Once across the channel, the wounded are disembarked. Some with minor injuries are disappointed to be out of action. Others say they're lucky to be alive. The numbers of casualties have not been released, but military sources say they had feared a greater attrition rate. As airfields are being opened in France, special hospital planes are being used to ferry some of the most seriously wounded from the advanced battle areas. Fast treatment and evacuation out of the danger zone are essential to maintain the momentum of the Allied advance. Now, 5 days into the invasion, the beachheads are secure enough to enable the first Allied field hospital to be established. American troops have borne the brunt of the casualties, and nurses and doctors are working around the clock to alleviate their suffering. Wounded British soldiers are evacuated home as soon as possible and dispersed to hospitals all over the country by train. The authorities say next of kin of men on the danger list will be notified by telegram, and travel warrants will be provided. In many southern towns, local people have offered to billet relatives overnight so they can visit their injured menfolk.
The West End of London, full of servicemen and women for the past few months, is unusually quiet now. There are few men in uniform to be seen. They're either already over in Normandy or on their way there.
Piccadilly Circus looks almost its old self again. Eros is still boarded up for protection, but since D-Day, there seem to be fewer uniforms about. Queues for the cinema and theatre are shorter, and it's rumoured that you can even find a taxi without a GI inside. They're all in Normandy. There's a Russian theme for this season's opening night, to mark the opening of the 50th season of Promenade Concerts. Earlier this week, Sir Henry Wood, the founder of the Proms, was made a Companion of Honour by the King, and Sir Henry has no intention of retiring.
And although we celebrate this anniversary in the year of my Promenade Concerts Jubilee, I assure you I do not contemplate retirement.
With the opening of the second front, British films are taking the offensive too. The Way Ahead opens tonight at the Odeon in Leicester Square. The Way Ahead stars David Niven and Stanley Holloway. It tells the story of a typical platoon of soldiers. With humour and realism, it follows them from raw recruits to battle-hardened veterans. The script is co-written by a young recruit with a Russian name, Peter Ustinov, and based in part on his own British Army experiences.
Too stupid for words.
Work is beginning this weekend on London's new airport. There's been a mystery over its exact location since Brigadier General Critchley, the Director General of British Overseas Airways Corporation, said last March that it would be within 12.5 miles of Hyde Park. Well, now the secret is out. Today, scores of lorries and bulldozers assembled at the village of Heathrow near Hayes. Roads were closed and nearby farmers are being given a month's notice to vacate their property. Archaeologists are rushing to Caesar's Camp, a Celtic settlement which they say is one of the most ancient sites in Britain. They're arranging a hasty dig for remains before it's covered with concrete. According to one estimate, the main runway will be 5 miles long and more than 2 million square yards of concrete will be laid for runways and taxiways. It will be, say officials, the finest and best equipped airport in the post-war world. Sport, and at Lord's, a crowd of more than 10,000 saw the England 11 under Wally Hammond beat Leary Constantine's West Indies side by 166 runs. The West Indies were bowled out for 77. It's Ascot again, and today saw a full day's racing with the jockey Gordon Richards riding 4 winners in succession: Red Fife, Neola, Milling and Isle of Capri. It's increased speculation about which horse he will ride in the Derby in a week's time, one of the few major races the champion jockey has never won. And finally, back to D-Day. Ever since the day dawned 5 days ago, people have been wondering what the D stands for. Letters to the newspapers have made various suggestions. For example, the D stands for deliverance. But Supreme Allied Headquarters says that the D stands simply for day. And on this D-Day +4, we have a dispatch from the BBC's Richard Dimbleby. Today, he flew to France in an RAF Mosquito. Here's his description of the scene below.
Hello, BBC. This is Richard Dimbleby calling you from over the English Channel, flying between England and France. This must be the first time that anyone like me has been able to call you from a formation of fighters, single-engined aircraft which can't take a passenger. The only reason that I'm here is because I'm traveling in a Mosquito which can carry a second person, and we have tacked ourselves onto the back of the fighter formation. For years, I've been used to describing things, but I find it difficult to tell you just how this looks. In front of the great mass of shipping, there's the great pattern of France, cratered and re-cratered where our bombs have fallen in the past. Here is the new landing strip, lying out, looking for all the world like an old established and magnificently prepared aerodrome. We're diving down and coming in over it right now, flying straight over the top. And there, in the distance, and all round us, as though in a great semicircle, is the battlefront. I can see the whole of it from east to west.
And with that description from Richard Dimbleby watching the Allied forces in the fields of Normandy, we end our coverage of the news of D-Day week 1944. That was the news 50 years ago. In fact, the war was far from over. Only 3 days later, Hitler retaliated by releasing his secret weapon, the V-1 flying bomb, nicknamed the Doodlebug. More than 100 of them were dropped on Britain over the next few weeks. It took 50 days for the British Army to advance beyond Caen to a stage they should have reached on D-Day +5. It took 75 days of fighting before the Allied armies broke out of Normandy and moved towards Paris. During this period, the military casualties were huge. 400,000 men were killed or wounded. 170,000 of them were Allied troops. Nevertheless, by Christmas, the Allies were on the German border, and by March, they were over the Rhine and into Germany. The war ended 2 months later, on D-Day +336.